Thank you for coming. My name is Theodore Spyropoulos, and I have the pleasure of working with a lot of really good people. And I have the pleasure, I think, of coming to this place as a kid who was 22 years old without any real clue. And following up, I think, on the conversation that we started with Sajay yesterday, part of the whole process, I think, of discovery is actually really trying to understand what architecture really is. And part of that, I think, is really being in an environment and in a framework that allows you the opportunity to really try to discover what that could be. And I don't think you do that by yourself, and I don't think you do that out of nostalgia. I think you do that with working with other people. And part of that is also not really making assumptions about what the nature of work actually is. So I stand here, I guess, almost every time with some degree of humility, a lot. And I still feel, I think, very connected to this place, and I think after 2 days today, I feel more so. Mostly because I think sustaining, I think, a certain engagement in things is really difficult. And anybody who tells you that this thing is easy, well, they don't have a fucking clue, actually. Beyond that, I think, Patrick was mentioning how we sort of try to evolve a research project. And I also think it's very important to state that we could disagree, and I think we do a lot, but we also have a lot of respect. And I think the idea of respect is not necessarily personal. The idea of respect is in terms of actually really seeing what it actually means to really try to work on these things and to be generous enough to try to share that and to try to make that as accessible as much in discourse and practice, resources. And this place, as much as any other place, I could be honest with you, has a limit of resources in terms of literal stuff. But in terms of generosity, I think it's one of the few places that I would say remain as a space where that is somehow assumed, that that's the state of affairs of things. And as far as I'm concerned, that should continue. The talk today was supposed to be more of a conversation. So if I'm really honest, I'm going to have a conversation with myself, with you, with people that I've had conversations with, and I think in some way have started to shape, I think, a lot of the things that I feel a bit strong about. Specifically in terms of actually what we've been looking at over the 2 days, I think a lot of them are real speculations about things. I think kids come here with the ability to actually really want to work on things. And I know it's graduate school open day, and this is the only thing that I'm going to say about that. I don't think we've ever said no to anything. Other than the fact that if you have ideas and there are ways of working on stuff, you actually have a commitment to demonstrate that. And you earn, I think, that commitment. And you earn the capacity of actually exploring these ideas, I think, just through really engagement, communication, and dialogue. And so for today's talk, at least in terms of the conversation, we've spoken about future. But the future that we're speaking about is really about today. And I wrote a really short little thing that I threw up on the website, which was really about 2 words, future and culture. And one could argue motivated much of what could be considered progressive design thinking historically. What once gave agency as a rallying point for an attitude and approach towards design, theory, and technology has been for some time in question. Who speaks of the future today? What defines culture? Marshall McLuhan reminds us that if one speaks of the future, then we must look to the present because we live in the past. He also reminded us that culture is what most people do every day. If this should be so, within our contemporary today, then by necessity, we may need to expand beyond people and to include, I think, these dynamic agencies, algorithmic, machines, synthetic ecologies, as part of this dialogue of how we interrelate with, I think, a much deeper ecology of. And as we refactor our everyday, within an ever-evolving interface of communication, how will these relationships evolve? How will we engage? And as we speculate if there is such a thing called future and culture today, we seek it to understand how architecture and design is thrown into question. What new architectures will evolve and push design into the future of future present? McLuhan, I think, is a really interesting character because one of the people that I was going to engage in a bit of a conversation is one of our, well, let's put it this way, he's the longest standing faculty of this school, named David Green. And he's also our newest faculty in the DRL. So we should have sound on this one.
Because they're afraid of them. From the moment of birth, people sense that the environment, the new environment around them is hostile. It's a real threat to their whole existence. And so every time an environment changes, we hasten to seek security and comfort in the old environment. I was delighted to come across a passage in Shakespeare a few days ago, a familiar passage, which suddenly revealed the same message. One touch of nature makes the whole world kin, that each, with one consent, pursues newborn gods, though they be made and molded of things past. The new is always made up of the old, or rather what people see in the new is always the old thing, the rearview mirror. The future of the future is the present. And this is something that people are terrified of.
And if anybody knows David, he would be into that, and you'll see why. But McLuhan, I think, is an interesting character for him, and also Buckminster Fuller. And part of that was about really trying to explore what these things are. Trying to understand something doesn't necessarily mean you're a proponent of it. You're just trying to understand and to try to situate it. And he put a book out called The Medium is a Massage, and used a quote from Bob Dylan where he said, because something is happening, but you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones?
About architecture.
Mr. Green?
I don't know. Do you know what architecture is? I don't know anymore. I used to, you know. The subtle play of form and sunlight and all that. A is for architecture, the mother of the arts. Or was it the motherfucker of the arts? I mean, what is anything anymore in this sunny global village? What's art? What's music? What's good? What's bad? It all seemed to be so clear then. The art of building, the quest for beauty, all those mind-bending discussions about form and space and meaningful style. It all...
That's a young David Green, right? Still the coolest guy in this place. He wrote an article in AD in 1969, which he titled, "Are You Sitting Uncomfortably, Then I'll Begin." And he tried to speak about things. At the time, I think in this place, there was obviously Cedric Price and Gordon Pask and Archigram, but there was also discussions with Siam and all of these other kinds of things with the Smithsons. And he wrote this as a kind of open letter. David likes to write love letters. And this love letter was for the future. And I'm just going to read a little bit of it because I think in some way, even if his words are problematizing it, it's not, well, knowing Archigram, you realize that this isn't negating something, it's actually trying to discover something. He says, the future is today, like in a McLuhan sense. The future doesn't exist. And its impossible existence can only be imagined by making probable predictions based on the present and past events and information. Is rocketry a viable prediction given information available on energy sources in 1830? Today is tomorrow. The identification of future is favored by being turned on by the present. How about that? Do I, the future, have no body? No eyes, am I, the future of a world? Love garden, am I, a soft jelly food? A galaxy of electrodes as the birth rate declines, the artificial womb comes into use, routine housework disappears, and work becomes a low muscle activity. High brain endeavor, mid-21st century, women will become completely equal to man. Socially and economically, seconds will no longer be tied to childbirth. Tell me something new. The greatest industry, sorry, it's not seconds, it's sex. I think everybody's 18, so it's okay. The greatest industry of the early 21st century will be amusement supply. Moon vacations, personal reaction motors enabling people to move through the air as scuba divers move through water. The present is the future. The future doesn't exist, now does it? Do it now. New sins will appear. Can I touch you? Do I need you? Or do I imagine you? Does Earth need man? Does man need legs? Do legs need feet? Why do you care? Why do you care about me, the future? Okay, so if David was here, pretend that was the voice of David. He continues, and that was that passage.
Feeling that architecture hasn't caught up, and it's all a hindrance. There's been a notion around for some time that it ought to be a good idea to drop everything and start all over again. You can see it in music and art. And I suppose we ought really to do that with architecture. A is for architecture, what's that? But where do we start? We've got to start with ourselves. Each one of us in the situation that we find ourselves in. The day of the expert is dead. Willing to do it yourself as a power tool. Public opinion as a technology, and the earth as a zoo in space.
Okay. So if you've been here the last couple of days, you could probably think that some of those things were kind of open for interrogation. And some of these kids, just like David, would be speculating about things. And McLuhan and others like Olbrist and Copeland have taken on board this kind of strategy to sort of make statements about the world. And I think today we live in a time when it's easy to say something and it's difficult to actually work on that project. And part of the reason that people have a difficulty with working on the project is because they don't actually feel that they have agency. And I think one of the things that we are trying, in a certain sense, I think with our 20th anniversary and titling this agenda Constructing Agency, is to try to understand how we can sort of bring that back in a certain way. The discussion about future, and I think many of us would say future is something very 60s or 70s. It's true that nobody really talks about that stuff, but actually it's promoted in a certain way. I participated in this thing called Future Fest in England and London in particular, which asked what was the future of democracy, the future of global machines, money, music, thrills, and invited people like Snowden and George Clinton and John Ronson and Owen Jones and a whole host of people. I was asked to speak about the future of machines, and I always thought that the future of machines was architecture. If you look in cinema, for a long period of time, I think this idea of future was being discussed. Well, what happens actually when we're a moment when science fiction has become fact? So if you're French, new wave kind of style, and you're a Godard fan and you like things like Alphaville, you'd see moments like this actually that would throw that into question. And I always thought that this was an amazing little moment in the movie where this young lady basically says no one has lived in the past and no one will live in the future. When we speak about living, I think it's important to see how architecture has always really engaged in this in really different ways. So this is an experiment from the Architecture Machine Group. 10-year experiment that became the media lab that was part of the communication revolution. We've seen that world kind of come into fruition, and architecture was, in a certain sense, an important part of that, if you see the media lab as having some kind of influence, which many people do. But things like this, life in a computerized environment, it's interesting. It has a McLuhan-esque kind of strategy of communicating things with Quentin Fiore. And this is today. What happens when we actually sort of evolve that beyond just kind of slogan and actually start to see how we participate with all of these things that are around us? Technology is not something outside of us. We are technology. This is Deep Dream. This is computer vision programmed by Google and basically used through a neural network to sort of identify patterns. We do that all the time. But these tools are doing more than that, and I think within architecture it's doing a lot more, but one of those things is trying to understand us. And I think at the heart of it, actually, this is what all is really happening. Now, there's a premise about trying to understand us. It means that it also has to make certain assumptions about us. And by making assumptions and about speaking about optimization and about thinking about things in this way, we start to believe that that's actually what we want. You start drawing a bunny rabbit, or it thinks it's a bunny rabbit, well, you actually get a fully formed bunny rabbit. This isn't the idea of drawing like Peter Cook would actually be very nostalgic about. This is something else. This is actually a kind of very different and new world, but it's not a new world in terms of the discourse and the discussion. You know, people like Gordon Pask was talking about that all the time in the way that he sort of spoke about when it comes to the issues to deal with systems, or how do one really sort of see the humanity within these things. And he said man is prone to seek novelty in his environment, and having found a novel situation, he or she will try to control it. What does that really mean, control? Within a lot of the stuff that we've been doing, I think we've tried to fundamentally see architecture as something that's very spatial, not beyond screen and this idea of the digital, which, to be honest, I haven't heard the word used in the DRL. I didn't hear it actually so much when I came here in '99. And so when we start to talk about the world as almost like three-dimensional voxelization, where we could zoom in, things are scaleless, but they're relational. We could develop strategies to think about things as behavior, and we could try to sort of work on a methodology and a workflow which actually problematizes the very nature of the thing that we're trying to explore if we make assumptions, if we try to work in a very linear way. And what I've always kind of found very important is that these things, no matter how complex, are accessible, because in some sense they're principled, and that principled aspect of things allows us to sort of work on problems. That doesn't necessarily mean that those problems are easy or definable at first. But I also think that in the process of actually how a lot of the work within the DRL has evolved, I think one of the things that we've tried to do collectively is to think about how we can actually work on these things. Sometimes people think that we build these things because we feel like these robots are ready for production to take on the world. Fundamentally what it is that we're trying to educate and understand what it actually means to say what we do, and to actually have the courage or conviction, or actually just recognizing that this is the world that we live in, that we have access to this stuff, and having that access is as much about making things kinetic as it is for those things themselves to understand themselves as much as they do us. So when we start to actually think about the scales and the relationships, and when we start to actually ask ourselves questions about what is it that we're actually looking at, you'll see some projects like this trying to think about that. If I say something like a provocation, it doesn't matter if it's a person or a piece of sculpture or whatever. People think that I don't like people. I like people. But when we start to think about this world of information and communication, and to move beyond the kind of conversations of top-down or bottom-up, to think about real-time, to think about actually how we actually deal with complexity today, I think it's important, because when we situate some of this work, if we don't sort of engage with new terms of reference, we sort of start to revert back to kind of assumptions made, and maybe assumptions made when people didn't actually have access to this. So sometimes, you know, we can look back and say it's kind of archigram-esque, or it's something like this, or it's Kiesler, or whatever. And of course, it's part of a lineage, but I think we have to actually see what the differences are.
Why should art and culture suddenly become very big business, like big science? The reasons are tied up with the fact that we're living in an information age. When you live in an information age, culture becomes big business, education becomes big business, and the cultural explosion or the information explosion becomes itself culture. It knocks down all the walls between culture and business, as between education and business. There's no longer any gap between the campus and the Wall Street or very big business.
He's talking about 1968. He's not talking today. And I think it's important to kind of understand that You know, sometimes we sort of pull out quotes or we sort of kind of very superficially look at certain things, but the context of where we operate and I think the dynamic of what makes something contemporary today is very important for us to really try to discover what that is. And I always really believe, and I think it is shared, that architecture today, whatever that definition actually is, has to participate, has to really engage in this information-rich environment that's out there. It's shaping our lives, and the way that we need to operate within that is to construct frameworks that allows for change, allows for difference, allows for things to be latent or unknown. And the challenges, I think, also, which are not obviously to architecture, but are much more in terms of how we speak about some of these things, is that some of the same people that are constructing this new world are also undoing it because of fear of some of the things that they actually start to second guess themselves. Because this isn't a problem of an individual. This is really the nature of a new kind of situation, which is the nature of the collective. Some of these problems are so complex and so entangled with other things that this idea that we can specialize in something is limited. Of course we can specialize in something, but if we don't construct interfaces to make that meaningful, I think that's important. So AI is obviously something that is in conversation quite a lot today, but it's a term that's been around for a long time. It's had its glory days and it's had its not so glory days. But at the moment, when we have people like Elon Musk speaking that it's problematic or something, they're speaking about the way that it's being conducted today. It's not against AI, it's basically how we think about it. Because if you start to think about the world as it is and use it as a blueprint for how these systems should manage themselves, then basically what you're asking them to learn from is basically what you already know. And I think that this is part of the challenge, and I think part of the things that we need to think about. And this doesn't extend in some way just holistically towards systems that we speak about, or robotics or industrialization. You have somebody like James Lovelock, who you may know as one of the principal Gaia scientists, speaking very adamantly about ecology and environments and so forth, and he's quite notorious recently because he basically said that to deal with the future, and the future I think for him is a bit dark. The future would actually mean the survival of humanity would mean that 2/3 of the people in this room would have to disappear for the 1/3 to survive. And when he says a provocation like that, and he's actually a very distinguished scientist, it's either he's maverick or he's just basically looking at the world slightly more objectively and maybe more alarmist. And now, he's written another book. Funny, it's called A Rough Ride to the Future, because obviously he's not pushing forward that kind of extreme thing, because if it's so extreme, then actually people don't feel like they have any responsibility or accountability to sort of work on these things. But the funny thing about where he sees the possibilities for this to be kind of augmented is in something that we work on all the time and we talk about it. And he speaks about the general assumption about robots, and he says instead of robots going to war with us and taking over the world, which is the way it's portrayed in science fiction, I thought, what happens if we join with them? And he uses very basic things. He has a pacemaker, and he was basically sort of saying that already we have this much more hybridized idea of what those things actually are. And a lot of those conversations, I think, were always kind of evolving, and you had people like Roy Ascott, who was talking about this notion of the construction of change. Roy was on the cybernetic committee that was part of Fun Palace. That obviously resonates within this context quite a lot. And he says cybernetic methods may be characterized by a tendency to exteriorize its concepts in some solid form, to produce models and hardware of the natural or the artificial system it is discussing. It is concerned with what things do and how they make them, and with the processes within which behave. It takes a dynamic view of life, not unlike that of the artists. Phenomena are studied insofar as they do something or are part of something that is being done. The identity we give to what we perceive is always relative, yet it presupposes a whole. Everything changes ceaselessly, We investigate our world best by seeing the system or the process before evaluating the thing. Cybernetics is concerned with the behavior of the environments, its regulation, and the structure that reveals the organization of its parts. Cybernetics is not only changing our world, it's presenting us with qualities of experience and modes of perception that are radically altering our conception of it. And this is coming out of a discourse of cybernetics which was very much second order, which is about observers in the world. Each observer having a kind of radical constructivist concept of the world, which meant that everybody's world is their own. And we have to not make or presuppose the assumption that we understand each other. And in a certain way, I think in some sense, it's a very speculative and open and abstract thing. But on the other hand, I think when it comes to the systems that we design, I think it's important to be able to understand the deep meaning of what that actually entails, because I think that is really at the heart of the much deeper speculation about where all this can go. Speculation, I think, is very much at the heart of architecture. And sometimes people speak about modern and postmodern, and sometimes people say we were never postmodern, and sometimes people say we were never post-digital. And if I'm really honest with you, I feel that it's a bit of a distraction. Yes, we can say that, but what does that actually fundamentally mean? If you continuously look in the rear view, you're not really addressing the complexities that are dealing with on the everyday. Before you enter your office, before you actually enter this place as an educational area. And when you look at people like Frank Lloyd Wright at a time proposing something like Broadacre City, it wasn't even an issue about talking about architecture. You have flying machines, little drone-like pods that are moving around. He designed little vehicles that you see there that were single occupancy monowheels. And when I look at some of the work that my students have been working on, we've been working on those things as well, and we've been working at the scale of urbanism when we were doing parametric urbanism. We tried to develop our own flying machines. It's not like we're doing something so radically different. It's not special for that reason. It's special because it's important to work on these problems. Working on those problems means that you also understand you're not really working on these things by yourself. So we've obviously had a lot of stuff going on with drones, but also we were doing a lot of drones in the DRL when it was still legal to fly these things and get them lost in central London, which we did a lot. But for example, you have Raffaello Di Andrea actually working with drones, and this is mostly about having a completely controlled and constrained environment to monitor them. And this is really to show that the dexterity of the vision system and the reaction, obviously, of the drone. But I always really like it because always, if it's a drone interacting with another drone or a person interacting with another drone, I think this kind of human to human, human to machine, or machine to machine aspect of it, I think, is very important, because it actually means that it's part of a much deeper kind of possibility. When you see some of the projects that are in the DRL, some of them are incubating ideas that I think other generations will take on board. So one of my teams made this almost hovercraft. They made a hovercraft version of something that very easily could become a drone. And they speculated with that idea, and they decided not to do that. But it's part of this larger world, and how those things come together, how a lot of the projects, like the one that you see on the side, is part of a lineage of just looking at these kind of transformations of cubes and spheres. And sometimes I get some colleagues that like to think that I'm very primitive in my kind of Greek natureness. It's not that I have any real interest in cubes or spheres, but I do have an interest in exploring some of the ideas and the relationships between things, and they seem to be working pretty well. But what they start to open up is a problem of population and the idea of actually what do? You can work tangibly with small populations. If you're really hardcore, maybe you do 30, 50, 100, 200. You're trying to do something like this that has 500,000. If it's a particle system that has no real identifiable intelligence, that's one thing. If you try to keyframe an animation like this, maybe you can get away with it to a certain level, but are you really addressing the problem? And I think we've worked on all versions of it, and we still do today, because one of the things is that we're sort of trying to build up the knowledge and the capacity to understand first, and then to take informed decisions because of that. And I think Patrick spoke to that today quite well. The other one is to sort of discover things. You may sort of, in one sense, do something with the assumption of trying to control something. But when you actually do something, regardless if it works, something else is possible as well, if you're open to it. And I still quite like this, and it's still one of my favorite videos in the DRL, and for reasons that are completely personal, but with my brother, we work quite a lot on trying to make things that enable people to be curious and to really sort of participate. But when I see my students kind of discovering that for themselves, I actually find a moment of self-reflection, which was that discovery that I had actually with Stephen. To continue this kind of dialogue, or if it is an evolution, you'll understand that a lot of these things were actually brought out without the main purpose. This is Walter Gray Walter, his wife, and the child. It could be Eli. It could be Nachi in the room. And what's interesting is that this was a study of brain science. These are the first kind of autonomous robots. This was shown in the Festival of Britain. This is 1950s.
Cheetah is the first.
If you look at colleagues working in different places, or our students actually visiting some of this stuff, Piaggio and Greg, working with these things. These are products that are coming out into the world, right? It's not science fiction, actually. People are actually working on this stuff. The question is if I need a kind of robotic backpack, it's something different. But it's really starting to open up, so I think, some real challenges. When things actually have their own agency, at one scale, it has certain implications. We've been talking, I think the media has completely been perversely fantasizing what the challenges of an autonomous car is. No, technically it's an amazing challenge, but realistically, the way that it's being problematized at the moment is actually just like an Uber driver. You're just not going to talk to your machine, or maybe you will. Maybe you'll have those confessionals that you really couldn't have with another human. And in the DRL, to be honest, we've been working on things like that too. We dealt with self-assembly, the first version of that. Octavian and Jan and Natasha were working on mobility with me and developed an idea of a single occupancy car based on a shared model like the Barclays system to augment infrastructure within London. When we say that architecture can be an infrastructure, it's interesting to understand and to qualify what that really means. So for example, in this case, we identified the fact that most cars are parked 90% of the time, they're idle. If you could have something like an Uber system and you could have a shared model, could these things be distributed in the city and actually create space as well? Why are those things important? Because we couldn't come up with that brief as a brief. It had to be something that we discovered. But the speculations about these things are also always there. I like to use this slide quite a lot. I think I've used it in pretty much like the last 100 lectures. But I think it still means a lot to me because this is 1913. This is scientific America. This was really a cover to try to explain actually what the city was. And it wasn't a piece of propaganda, it was a kind of promise. These weren't technologies that weren't being used at the time, and some of those things were actually being tested, like skyscrapers and zeppelins and all of these other stuff. And so if we look at that and we look at actually what we're looking at today, I think it's an issue. When you look at stuff like the Osaka Expo, there are moments actually when a large event actually really did prototype things and brought people together, from the archigram guys, from the metabolists. We're talking for a lot of the people in the audience before social media and really the internet. When you look at the scale of things, today we've talked about scale and we've talked about automation. This is, okay, excuse my Chinese, Qingdao, automatic port that just opened, completely autonomous. And we're talking about autonomous port systems that are managing one of the largest ports, I think currently the largest port in the world. We have a version of this in Rotterdam. We have people like Rolls-Royce investing basically in carriers that are going to be completely unmanned. And what does that really mean? Well, it actually means that it's fundamentally of something else. So we could talk about if these things are fantasy or not, but this is our world today. This is how we manage things. And the next investment in terms of autonomous vehicles is not your personal vehicle, but it's how to get these goods off sea and onto land. And if you really see that that's your world today, then I think maybe you would be more encouraged to actually consider, well, actually, what's your role in this? Because if you think that these things define the city, if we sort of talk about how the automobile, all of that kind of stuff changed the idea of urbanism, and it did, and history serves that as a purpose, then we should actually try to understand actually what happens now. Because in some way, that 1913 model maybe is not that far away, except it doesn't actually come from us. So it comes from Amazon talking about deliveries, dropping it into your window, or it comes from companies speaking about autonomous vehicles. And the question is, well, what is this new urbanism? What is the future of the city if we're going to have highly densified kind of consolidation of humanity? And what does that mean when we actually are looking at systems that are going to be actually autonomous? Or at least able to take decisions on their own. And so I think in the DRL have been forced from the beginning to really look at different models of organization, and some of them were about spatiality, some of them were for reconfiguration, but as the project has kind of evolved, we've looked at everything. We've looked at termites, we've looked at history of architecture, we've looked at synthetic systems, material systems, all trying to discover how we can sort of try to understand that. And I think part of the speculation of this idea of culture is also to understand what this kind of stuff is. You know, this could be Amazon, it is. It could be other places as well. My brother works for a company called Guilt Group, and they were one of the first people on the East Coast to basically use a Kiva system to manage basically daily tens of thousands of interactions of goods and contexts moving throughout the world. And so when we start to look at that stuff and then we have a conversation about something that we term building, I think we actually have to say, well, actually, maybe building isn't the right word anymore. Maybe we have to think about the terminology to make it more accessible. We obviously believe in buildings and in architecture and all of these things, but maybe I learned quite early that architecture doesn't necessarily mean building. Or what true architecture isn't building. It's not the act of building, but if, you know, almost like 3/4 of the world is being built without architects, we have to actually speak about certain differences that make a difference. Thinking about those things also changes the nature of how we approach things. Speculations with my brother about future of fashion, where it's not about fashion anymore, it's space making. When we speak about the challenges of technology and its impact on people, we have these kind of situations which I think are really, really unfair. Because the way that they're discussed, on the one hand, makes this thing so simple. So here we have Lee Sedol. He is a world-renowned Go player. And obviously he is basically playing AlphaGo. And it's one of those kind of man versus machine, you know, this kind of setup, which obviously isn't really true. I mean, literally it's true. It's a piece of software against a human. But actually it's thousands of humans developing a software, iterating every possible pattern, and playing the game. So first time he lost, he thought he was just nervous. Second time he lost, he got frustrated, he felt like he was a total failure. Third time he lost, I mean, completely destroyed this man. And the premise of it was flawed from the beginning. Because realistically, instead of learning from him, who would be the world's #1 Go player that makes moves that are basically being studied across the board, the challenge was not to learn from him in that sense, but the challenge was just actually pattern every sort of occupational kind of strategy of pieces on a pattern. And that's fine, but basically it doesn't progress anything. What does it mean at the end of this day? That AlphaGo is a better player. And when you look at the history of these kind of automatons, it's over 100 years. And I've tried in a certain way to sort of map out some of these things. And when you look at the kind of timeline of history, you can go as back as 1949 and actually really see that these systems were being implemented within the discourse of architecture. And some of the people are familiar, like I mentioned, Walter Gray Walter and Negroponte, but other people like Pask and Edward Anatovich, who was working down the road at the UCL with projects like the Senster, were already kind of speculating on some of this stuff. And this idea of learning, I think, was also very important. And how systems learn, I think, is important in that sense. And Pask, I think, is a very appropriate model for that, because he sees learning as a kind of byproduct of trying to understand and control something. So the novelty of that, if incrementally you build a model for novelty, allows this thing to actually assimilate knowledge. And these propensities are the root of curiosity and the assimilation of this. And they impel man to explore, discover, and explain his inanimate surroundings. Addressed to the social environment of other men, they lead him into social communication, conversation, and other modes of partially cooperative interaction. When we consider, I think, some of the discussions that we have, I also like this example. It's kind of usually led prior with an image of Joseph Kossuth, but when we speak about things having their own agency, usually people just keep looking at their phone. The phone doesn't really have so much agency. When you ask if a chair understands its chairness, or what's chair-like, I think this becomes super interesting, because you actually have to really start to articulate what you actually mean, and it goes actually beyond language. It becomes something other. And in the history of a lot of the computational experiments, and as I think it's something that drives a lot of the discussions that we have for a long time now, you have people like Carl Sims, but he was doing this in the mid-90s, talking about evolving creatures, or talking about the taxonomy of forms, or talking about how could we design things that are basically things in themselves, but how they come together would allow them to actually drive behavior. We don't have a fixed body plan. Body plans are emerging things. In the studio, we try to explore that stuff all the time. What's the difference between having one spring? Well, one spring can roll and curl, but if we have 3 springs, we can basically make a walking behavior. Those things are pretty fundamental. What becomes problematic, though, is actually when we deal with very complex problems, but we deal with the orthodoxy and conservative nature of actually our sort of, let's call it, fetish about things. And I don't mean to undermine Mr. Ishiguro's lifetime experiment, but the lifetime experiment is actually to recreate himself, or at least the image of himself. He speaks about it from a Japanese perspective, though, that it's acceptable, because actually machines have soul. Okay, I'm going to play it so you hear it from him instead of me.
Professor Hiroshi Ishiguro is Japan's foremost android scientist, and Geminoid HI-1 is Japan's foremost android. Inspired by Japan's unique spiritual beliefs, they are blurring the boundaries between humans and robots.
It's a question of where the soul is. Japanese people have always been told the soul can exist in everything and anything. So we don't have any problem with the idea that a robot too has a soul. We don't.
So this is Hiroshi, and then this is what really scares people. This is Boston Dynamics. And Boston Dynamics was really like a virtual YouTube company for a long time, because that's all that was able to be seen. And then it was bought by Google, and then people got really afraid. Except some people think that Google are good people. But you start to see this kind of stuff, and you see the dexterity, but you also see, I think, fundamentally a little bit of a problem, right? This is a kind of cyber Terminator-like thing. If I can build a robot that can do anything, why would I build it in the image of myself? It's not that different of a problem. When it's slightly hybridized, like in this video, then people should really get scared. Still can do everything the other one can do, but much faster. Can lift things in ways that obviously we wouldn't lift it. But you understand what I mean? Like, it has a capacity to understand itself, at least, right? And all of those self-regulated systems, we look at a video like that and we say like, wow, there's some technology out in the world. We don't look at that stuff in the cars that we drive. We don't look at that stuff in almost all aspects of automation. Those kind of deep-rooted human stuff is also part of my interest. And when I first came here, I really was interested with Vasilis to really try to explore this idea of identity and face. And we tried in 2003 and 2002 to develop strategies of actually dealing with that, camera recognition. We were exploring all kinds of stuff with Nick and other students of ours here. And we developed kind of systems and iterations to do that, a kind of portrait machine. And if you look at our world today, you start to look at stuff in a very different way. Even the description of the face is also something that's very open for interpretation. This is an algorithm for face alignment. This isn't an algorithm that's trying to understand your identity. But this is an algorithm that basically creates a probability based on the resolution of that face, in terms of the points mapped onto it, not only of your emotional aspects of things, but actually what that gesture will be. So sort of capturing that stuff and starting to see that even how we are seen by the systems that we create are fundamentally different. We are not looking at the face. And if you start seeing this stripped away from all of that stuff, you would understand it in a world that actually is just as abstract as some of the notational systems that we have. And a lot of the things that I've been working on with minima forms, and I think a lot of the things that we've been doing in the studio here at the DRL, is really trying to explore those kind of worlds. And those kind of worlds are important because these are snapshots or a moment in time. And those moments, you could sort of capture them, but I think it's the space in between those moments that I think are fundamental, because it's not an issue about selection, it's something fundamentally different. And just like my student discovering stuff, we try to put those things out into the world. This installation actually opened today or yesterday in Beijing. And the interesting thing is that every time that this thing is shown in a different context, the idea of culture actually refactors its meaning. So if I'm honest, in Sweden, we couldn't call it petting zoo because that's implicated something when it was translated. When now it was basically launched today, the translation for all of the works, which was something at the Barbican, came back with a title for the project. I feel a little bit shy of saying this, talking about sucking cats. Don't ask me. I asked my students to think that if it was a translation issue, and I was told, no, Theo, we don't use these characters so much. So if you type in petting zoo Beijing, you can find out for yourself. But to do these kind of things is not so much about the kinetics. We were also trying to explore vision systems and trying to understand basically how can you identify an individual in a similar way like some of the technologies that are being used for facial recognition or phone things, and the difference between a blob detection strategy, the difference between kind of a skeletal strategy. And when you start to see these things in the city, because sometimes it's just looked at, well, oh, you guys use the Connect, yes, and some libraries and all of that stuff. I've never really foregrounded the technologies we use because I actually don't care. But when you start to see it in the domain of the street, when you start to identify all of these things, you start to situate that relative to some of the kind of cultural readings of these things. So when Petting Zoo was actually first shown at the Frac and then at the Barbican, we were getting all of this kind of stuff, that two kids basically were trying to make robotic pets, but they're not really interested in pets. They don't want animals in the zoo, and at the end of the day, we're just asking about replacing a kind of so-called living thing with an inanimate thing that behaves like a living thing. And the funny bit about that is the cultural aspect of a lot of the synthesis, I think, comes back to a lot of things. And it's some people will say, oh, you're very technologically optimistic about stuff. Or you go to the other end, or you become someone like David, which at the same time is very much an optimist, but has a lot of self-doubt. And I think that that's actually really important. And at the end of his article, he basically said, which was titled that this was in definition of what the cybernetic forest would be, right? The one that I spoke to you about before, about the future. He finishes the article by basically saying, select your favorite dream and let's swap dreams. That's what it's all about. Like the song says, you can be in my dream if I can be in yours. Always remembering your dream can be my nightmare. Here's my dream. And I think, like, in a really interesting way, and David is, I think, a poet, and I've talked a lot about him today because I asked him and two students from the undergrad, Jumana and say it loudly because I can't. Amaya, I just need to sort of pay my respects, asked him to basically define for him what future and what culture is. And I got back this half-hour dialogue, which I would have played, but I think everybody is already pretty much dead about it. But I'll post it because I think it's beautiful. But the first question that David asked is, why did I ask? And then the second question was actually not to respond himself, but to ask the students who were asking him the question. And David's good in that way. And I think I think it's important to ask ourselves better ways of asking questions. So I don't want to sort of bemoan this, but I do want to describe one last thing. I used a specific image, which I thought was really interesting. It's another love letter. But this one is a love letter that was actually written by an artist named Solowit. And Solowit is interesting because for people like Eisenman, for a lot of the formalists in New York, he was part of the reconceptualization, notes to conceptualize architecture. And a lot of his things, if you look at a project like that, would fit very directly in that. But at the same time, he also had another side, and he wrote maybe one of his most personal pieces of text as a letter to another artist a month after he saw her. And he wrote it not as a love letter. This isn't about intimacy. This is about the idea of doubt and creativity, and actually once in a while not caring about what everybody else is thinking, and having the ability to actually work and see work as something that's just fundamentally yours, and you take responsibility of that, but you don't necessarily have to be a slave to other people's opinions on it. And I'm going to read it to you because I think it's a nice letter for this place too. And I'm not a guy who reads, and when I was on script this morning, I didn't add Ross Lovegrove and all of that kind of stuff, so excuse me if I'm not an orator like David, but I read it anyway. And so it says, Dear Eva, or it could be AA, it will be almost a month since you wrote to me, and you have possibly forgotten your state of mind. I doubt it though. You seem the same as always, and being you, hate every minute of it. Don't. Learn to say, fuck you, to the world once in a while. You have every right to. Just stop thinking, worrying, looking over your shoulder, wondering, doubting, fearing, hurting, hoping for some easy way out. Struggling, grasping, confusing, itching, scratching, mumbling, bumbling, grumbling, humbling, stumbling, numbling, rambling, gambling, tumbling, scumbling, scrambling, hitching, hatching, bitching, moaning, groaning, honing, boning, horse-shitting, hair-splitting, nitpicking, piss-trickling, nose-sticking, ass-gouging, eyeball-poking, finger-pointing, alleyway sneaking, long-waiting, small-stepping, evil-eyeing, back-scratching, searching, perching, besmirching, which I didn't know what that meant, grinding, grinding, grinding away at yourself. Stop it and just do. And that was his real advice to another artist that wasn't really meant to be read. It's the only piece of text that he's actually written that's really personal. This is the artist that actually didn't draw his drawings, just sent instructions like a computer. But in a strange way, when it came to actually speaking to someone else about the nature of creativity, the idea of self-doubt, and actually the idea of the practice, he really felt that doing things actually gives a lot of legibility. And that's not an issue of doubt, actually, that's an issue of responsibility. And so I leave that because I think maybe that's something that we can consider. And I think people have been really generous sticking around. And I just want to really thank our critics, and I want to thank our students, and I want to thank our staff, because I think Patrick and I know that actually we wouldn't be able to do any of this stuff if it wasn't for all of these guys working with us. And I actually want to thank also Yen, who kind of helped me to put this lecture together, because like a lot of things in this moment in time, we're doing a lot of things. And I think the support of other people have always been really important, and I thank you for your attention. I don't think you have questions because there's nothing really to ask. I'm not really even sure I said very much. This was one of those things that I felt I could have this conversation with myself just in front of a lot of people. So I don't think that there need to be. We go and have a drink and enjoy the day, and like other people in the world, I think it's technically Friday and we're supposed to be out and about. That's what I've been told. Anyway, thanks so much.